The morning they told Seraphine Ashville she was to be married, the sky outside her window was the color of a bruise. She had known something was coming. She had felt it in the careful way her father refused to meet her eyes at supper, in the way her stepmother had stopped criticizing her embroidery, in the strange, suffocating kindness that had settled over Ashvale House like smoke before a fire. Kindness, in her experience, was what people offered instead of an apology. She was 19 years old. She had her mother's dark hair, her father's stubborn jaw, and nothing else in the world she could call her own. Her father delivered the news standing by the fireplace, as if he needed something solid at his back. Lord Ashvale was a man of moderate fortune and enormous debt, and both of those facts lived plainly on his face. "You are to be wed to the Duke of Thornwall," he said. The arrangement was finalized last evening. Seraphine set down her tea. She did not spill it, she did not gasp. She had learned, over many years of living in this house, that a visible reaction was a weapon handed freely to someone who would use it. "Thornwall," she repeated. Her father looked at the fire. Every person, in every county, knew the name. The Duke of Thornwall Kylandray was not a man discussed openly, only referred to in lowered voices and half-finished sentences. He had inherited his title at 17 after both his father and elder brother died within the same winter, under circumstances that remained, depending on who you asked, tragic or suspicious. He had not attended a single social event in 4 years. He ran his estates alone, received no guests, and had, according to rumor, reduced 3 previous marriage candidates to tears before they had even reached the altar. He was the wealthiest man in the Northern Territories, and he was, by every account, as dark and unmoving as the stone fortress that bore his name. "They are giving me away like a debt repaid," she thought, "because that is exactly what I am." She looked at her father's profile, the guilt folded into the lines around his mouth, and understood everything in a single breath. The debts, the creditors, the quiet disappearance of her mother's jewelry from the cabinet last winter. The Duke of Thornwall had bought her, and her father had let him. "When?" she asked. "A fortnight." Seraphine stood, smoothed her skirt with both hands, and left the room without another word. She would not give him the tears. She would not give any of them the tears. What she would give them, she had not yet decided, but she was already thinking. The journey north took 3 days. Seraphine rode in a carriage that smelled of cedar wood and old money. The Duke's carriage, sent for her as if she were cargo to be collected. 2 trunks. 1 lady's maid, Bess, who was barely 16, and spent the first day crying quietly into her cloak. And a letter, delivered the morning of her departure, sealed in black wax with a Thornwall crest. A tower in a storm. She opened it somewhere in the gray middle of the 2nd day, when the hills had gone dark and Bess had finally fallen asleep. It contained 4 sentences. "You will be given the east wing. You will not enter the west. You will dine alone, unless summoned." Do not mistake this arrangement for something it is not. No signature. New name. Just the blunt architecture of a man who had decided, long before she arrived, exactly how much of himself he was willing to offer. None, she thought. He is offering none of himself. She folded the letter precisely. Then she tucked it into her bodice, close to her ribs, where she would not forget it. Good, she thought. Neither am I Thornwall Castle was exactly as terrible as its reputation suggested. It rose from the cliffside like something that had grown there, rather than been built, black stone and iron. Towers that cut the cloud apart, walls so thick the wind died against them. There were no flowers, no lanterns in the windows, no staff gathered at the gate to welcome the new Duchess. There was only one man. He stood in the entrance courtyard as her carriage drew through the gate, and Seraphine saw him for the first time through the rain's window. Tall, dark-coated, arms at his sides, with the stillness of a man who had never in his life fidgeted. His face was angular and unsmiling, his jaw set like a closing argument. He watched the carriage approach the way a man watches something he has already calculated and found unremarkable. He did not step forward when she descended. She had to walk to him. Of course I do, she thought. Everything in this place is a test, and he has designed every single one. She crossed the wet cobblestones with her chin level and her spine straight and stopped 2 feet from him. She was nearly a foot shorter. She looked up without apology. Up close, the Duke of Thornwall was something more complicated than ugly and less simple than handsome. There was a scar along his left jaw, pale against the dark of his skin. His eyes were gray, not the soft gray of morning light, but the gray of deep water in winter, the kind you couldn't see the bottom of. He looked at her the way a man catalogues a problem he has not yet solved. "Lady Ashvale," he said. His voice was low, unhurried, and entirely without warmth. "Your Grace," she returned, in exactly the same tone. Something shifted in those gray eyes. "The smallest thing." She caught it and filed it away. "You read my letter." "I did." And I found it instructive," she said. "You are a man who issues commands in lieu of introductions." "I will remember that." The silence that followed was the kind that could have gone many directions. He chose none of them. He simply turned and walked inside, and a housekeeper materialized from the shadows to show her to the east wing. Seraphine followed without being asked twice, but as she crossed the threshold into the cold stone corridors of Thornwall Castle, she allowed herself one private thought. He expected me to flinch. I didn't. And he noticed. The east wing was austere, but not unkind. A bed with heavy curtains, a fireplace that actually drew, a writing desk by the window that faced the sea. Seraphine stood at the window for a long time after Bess had unpacked and retreated, watching the waves destroy themselves against the rocks below with what struck her as extraordinary, purposeless loyalty. She did not sleep for hours. She spent the time instead doing what she had always done in difficult houses. She mapped the place, not with her feet, not yet, but with her mind. She thought about the letter, about the West Wing, the one she had been told not to enter, about a man who had been given everything and somehow ended up alone in a fortress on a cliff, collecting wives he did not want. "What are you afraid of?" she wondered, staring into the dark beyond her window. "What lives in the West Wing that you are keeping from me?" She would find out. She was, after all, still thinking. In the first week, she'd learned the shape of her captivity. She'd breakfasted alone in a room off the east corridor, where the table was always set for one. She walked the grounds in the mornings. The gardens had gone wild, all overgrown rose canes and broken sundials. But she found she preferred them to the formal order of the gardens at home. She read in the afternoons from the East Wing's small library, which contained an eccentric collection. Treatises on land law, 3 volumes of Thornwall family history, and an incongruous shelf of poetry she could not quite imagine them. Duke, reading Dotchi, did not see him. He was present only as an absence, doors that had just closed, meals that arrived precisely on schedule, a household that ran with mechanical efficiency. Despite its master's apparent invisibility, the staff spoke to her in monosyllables, not unkindly, but with a careful neutrality of people who had learned that opinions were dangerous. On the 4th day, she found the West Wing door. It was at the end of a corridor she had not been directed to, half hidden behind a tapestry that depicted a huntman and horses and the dark outline of prey. The door was oak, heavy, banded in iron, not locked. She tested the handle gently, with one finger, the way she might test ice on a winter pond. It gave. She did not go in. Not yet. She stood in the gap of the open door and let the air come to her instead, cold, and carrying the smell of old paper, candle wax, and something beneath that she could not name, something that felt like grief. She pulled the door shut. She had her answer to one question. What was in the West Wing was not locked away from her. It was left unguarded, which meant one of 2 things. Either the Duke did not care whether she went in, or he was testing whether she would obey. "I'll make him tell me," she decided, not by breaking his rule, by making him want to explain it. She was summoned to dinner on the 5th night. No warning. A folded note slipped under a door at 6. Asterisk, the dining room, 7 o'clock. Asterisk, she dressed carefully. Not elaborately, not in a way that could be read as trying to impress, but with the precision of a woman who understood that every choice she made in this house would be observed and interpreted. A dark blue gown. Her mother's earrings, small and silver, hair pinned back simply. She arrived at 7:01. He noticed. "You're late," the Duke said, from where he stood at the head of the table, already pouring wine. "By 1 minute," she said, taking the seat at the opposite end. "I wanted to establish early that I am not a person who rushes." She sat, said nothing. A small muscle moved in his jaw. The dinner was extraordinary. 4 courses, each one better than anything she had eaten in her father's house. She wondered who had ordered it, and whether it was a statement or simply a habit. She ate without commenting on it. They sat in silence for the length of the first course. Seraphine had never been afraid of silence. She had grown up in a house where silence was safer than speech, and she had learned to wear it comfortably like a cloak. It was the Duke who spoke first. "You have not cried." She looked up. "I beg your pardon." "The last one cried before the carriage reached the gate," he said, with the detachment of a man reporting weather. "The one before that lasted 2 days. You have been here 5. You have not cried. You have not complained. You have not sent letters begging to be released." "He has been watching," she realized. "Of course he has. Would any of those things have achieved anything?" she asked. "No. Then they would have been a waste of energy," she said. "I prefer to spend mine on things that work." This time the pause was longer. He looked at her with those winter water eyes, and she held the look without blinking, and something in the room changed temperature, not warmer, not quite, but different. A shift in pressure. "What things?" he said slowly. "Do you consider worth working toward?" She picked up her wine glass. "I haven't decided yet," she said. "I'm still learning the landscape." He did not smile, but something in his expression moved the way shadows move when a candle flickers briefly, almost invisibly, and then again. She filed that away too. She found the grave on the 7th day. It was in the far corner of the wild garden, almost entirely swallowed by ivy. The stone marker so weathered she had to crouch and trace the letters with her fingers. A name. A pair of dates only 14 years apart, and beneath the dates, in letters smaller than the rest, "She carried the light of this house. We carry her still." Seraphine sat back on her heels in the cold morning air and felt something she had not expected to feel it. Thornwall Castle? Sorrow? She did not know who the grave belonged to. She did not know yet how the person had died, or why the grave was here rather than in the village churchyard, or why the whole garden had been allowed to grow up around it like an embrace. But she felt the weight of the loss in the stone itself, the particular, specific grief of someone who had needed the burial to be close. She was still sitting there when she heard footsteps on the gravel path behind her. She knew without turning who it was. She had learned already the particular quality of his silence, the way it arrived before he did, the way it extended beyond him like a shadow. She did not move, did not pretend she hadn't seen the grave. "Your sister," she said quietly. "Not a question." The footsteps stopped. A long silence. The wind came off the cliff and moved through the ivy. "Mira," he said. His voice was different. Not softer, exactly, but stripped of its usual architecture, like a room with the furniture removed. She was 14. "I'm sorry," Seraphine said, and she meant it without reservation. She heard him move, not toward her, not away, just a small shift of weight. "The west wing was hers," he said. Seraphine closed her eyes briefly. "Of course it was. It isn't a forbidden place. It's a kept one." "You didn't lock it?" she said. "No. But you told me not to enter." "Yes." She finally turned and looked up at him. He was standing 3 feet away, looking at the grave with an expression she recognized, not grief. Exactly. Not in the active, undone sense. This was grief after years of compression. Grief that had been pressed until it took the shape of everything surrounding it. This, she thought, is what lives in this man, not cruelty. "Wait, I won't go in," she said, "unless you decide to show me yourself." He looked at her then. A direct look, the kind he hadn't given her before. Not cataloging, not calculating, just looking. "Why would I do that?" "Because eventually," she said, standing and brushing the damp earth from her skirt, "you will want someone to know who she was. And I will still be here." She walked back toward the house and did not look behind her. But she heard him, the sound of him staying by the grave long after she had gone, standing in the cold morning with his sister's name at his feet. It was the first time Thornwell Castle had felt like somewhere a person could breathe. After that, something shifted, not dramatically, not in any way she could point to a name. But small things changed in the weeks that followed. In the way small things change when a season is turning, you cannot identify the precise moment, only the accumulation. He began joining her for dinner regularly, without notes or summons, simply appearing. He ate in silence still, but it was a different silence inhabited, rather than imposed. He started leaving books on the table outside her door. Not with note, just the books themselves. A volume on the history of coastal estate management, a novel she had mentioned in passing, a slim collection of maps. She accepted each one without comment and left her own books outside his study in return. They did not discuss it. This was, she had come to understand, the Duke of Thornwell's language. He communicated in gestures and objects and loaded silences, and she was becoming fluent. The crisis came from the direction she had not been watching. Her father arrived at Thornwell in the 3rd month of her marriage, unannounced, with his solicitor and a document she had never seen before. She learned of his presence from Bess, who came to find her in the garden with wide eyes and the careful blankness of someone trying not to carry bad news, badly. She went to the receiving room and found her father seated, across from the Duke at a table covered in papers, and understood within 30 seconds what was happening. Her father had sold her a second time. Not her dowry. The terms he had agreed with Thornwell had included a land arrangement in the northern counties, a parcel of Hochfell-held ground that was meant to transfer on the marriage. Her father had already sold that land separately, secretly, 6 months before the wedding, to a merchant investor in the south. The Duke had married her in exchange for land he would never receive. It was fraud, quiet, cowardly, and complete. Her father would not look at her. The Duke was perfectly, dangerously still. "Lord Ashvale," the Duke said, in that voice that had no weather in it at all, "you will leave this house within the hour. You will leave the document. And you will not return. Now see here, Thornwell, within the hour." Her father left. The solicitor left. The door closed. Seraphine stood in the middle of the room and waited. She had not yet decided whether to apologize. She had done nothing wrong. She knew that, but she was conscious of what she was. The daughter of a man who had just defrauded the most powerful duke in the Northern Territories in his own house, to his face. The Duke stood at the window with his back to her, hands clasped behind him. "You knew nothing of this," he said. "Not a question! No! I believe you." He does, she realized, without hesitation. She didn't know what to do with that. The clean, unquestioned quality of his trust, it landed in her chest like something warm in a cold room. "This changes nothing about our arrangement," he said, still without turning. "You did not marry me for your father's debts, and I did not marry you for the land." A beat. "Then why did you marry me?" she asked. She had not planned to ask. It came out before she could decide otherwise. The pause that followed was the longest of any between them. He turned, and for the first time since she had arrived at Thornwell, she saw the single unguarded thing in his face. the thing he had been keeping in the west wing of himself. Because, he said carefully, as if each word had to be checked before a release, when your father proposed the arrangement, I asked for a report on you. And the only remarkable thing the investigator found was this, that every servant in your father's house, when asked about you in confidence, said the same thing. What did they say? That you were the only person in that house who had ever treated them as though they mattered. Seraphine looked at him for a long time. And then, very quietly, something she had been holding for months, the careful architecture of a woman who had learned not to need anything from anyone, shifted. Not collapsed, just moved, made room. That night, for the first time, he walked her to her door. They stood in the corridor outside the east wing, and the silence between them had changed entirely. It was no longer a wall or a test or an absence. It was simply two people standing in the same dark, breathing the same cold air, not yet ready to say what the night had become. The west wing, he said, without preamble. I will show you, if you still want to see it. I want to see it, she said. Tomorrow. Tomorrow, she agreed. He nodded once, turned to leave. Kaylin, she said. He stopped. She had never used his name before. Neither had he used hers. It was the first time in 3 months that they had been anything other than a title speaking to a title. He turned back, slowly. Thank you, she said, for believing me, without evidence. He was quiet for a long time. You have always given me evidence, he said finally. I simply had to learn to read it. He walked away down the corridor, and she watched him go. And for the first time since the morning she had heard the Duke of Thornwell's name spoken in the same breath as her future. Seraphine Asriel felt something she had almost forgotten the shape of. She felt like she was winning. Not over him, never over him. Over everything that had tried to make her small. Spring came to Thornwell, as if startled to find itself welcome. The wild garden, unpruned for years, exploded with a violence of color that no formal gardener could have planned. Roses running up the eastern wall, bluebells colonizing the gravel pads, the whole cliff edge soft with windflowers. Seraphine had stopped trying to manage it and started working with it instead, cutting away only what was dead, letting everything with life find its own direction. The Duke had begun doing the same. Not with gardens, with her. She had been inside the west wing now. She had stood in Myra's room and looked at the drawings still pinned above the desk, the books still exactly as they'd been left, the small pressed flower on the windowsill gone to powder but still, unmistakably, a flower. The Duke had stood beside her and talked for the first time. Really talked, not delivered information, not issued statements about his sister. Her love, her absolute refusal to be afraid of horses, the way she had been the only person in this house who had ever interrupted him. Seraphine had laughed at that last one. Kaylin had looked at her with an expression that was not quite surprise, and not quite relief, and said, very quietly, that she was only the second person who had ever laughed in this room. She had taken his hand without thinking about it, and he had let her. He did not let go. The household changed around them the way households do when their master changes slowly. Then all at once, staff who had crept through corridors in careful silence began to speak at normal volume. Bess stopped crying. The dining table, for the first time in 4 years according to the oldest housemaid, was set for 2. Letters arrived from Seraphine's father, increasingly desperate, increasingly ignored. The land dispute had been referred to the courts quietly, irreversibly, without mercy. She had not asked for that. The Duke had done it without consultation and then told her afterward. Watching her face with that particular attention he gave to things he was trying to understand. You didn't have to, she said. I know, he said. I wanted to. He wanted to, she thought. He wanted something for the first time in years, and it was this. She understood now what he had been before she arrived. Not cruel. She had never truly believed the cruelty. Not after the grave, not after the books left without notes, not after the way he said his sister's name in the dark with all that compressed love. He had been a man who had decided, after too much lost too early, that wanting things was a damage he could not afford. He had built Thornwall into a fortress, not to keep others out, but to keep himself from reaching out. She had simply refused to be kept out that hot bun. It turned out enough. On a morning in late spring, with the sea below the cliffs the color of hammered silver and the roses finally climbing the stone above Mira's grave, the Duke of Thornwall stood in the wild garden and watched his wife argue with a rose cane that had grown across the path. She was wearing her old gray dress, the one she had brought from her father's house, that she kept only because she refused to throw away things just because they came from somewhere. Painful. Her hair had escaped its pins on one side. She was talking to the rose cane, as if it might be persuaded. Something in his chest broke open, the way ice breaks in spring, not violently, but inevitably, the way things break when they have been holding against pressure too long and the warmth finally reaches them. He walked across the garden and took the rose cane from her hand and cut it back cleanly in 2 strokes. "Oh," she said, "that's simple." "Most things are," he said. "When you stop being afraid of the thorns." She looked at him with those eyes that had, in 3 months, learned every room in him, every locked door, every west wing, every grave he'd left. "Until I wasn't afraid of the thorns," she said. "I was arguing with them." "There's a difference." He looked at her. And then, for the first time in 4 years, in that wild garden with the sea below and his sister's name in the ivy and a woman who had arrived as a debt and become the only thing he'd not been able to reduce to something manageable, the Duke of Thornwall laughed. It was quiet, short, like a door opened for the first time in a long time. But it was real Serafini Ashivali, Serafini Drave. Now, though she was still getting used to the weight of it, looked at his face in the moment after the laugh faded, and thought, "There you are. I wondered when you would arrive." She had called me, too, Thornwall, as nothing. She had won something. No one had given her something she had built. Word by careful word, silence by silence, book by book, one grave at a time. She had not tamed the darkest duke in the kingdom. She had simply refused to be defeated by him, and he had loved her for it, quietly, completely, in the way that things built slowly are built forever.